in appreciation once again for your courtesies enabling this to happen, I yield back the balance of our time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The chair would remind all members to be in proper business attire when you come to the floor of the House. Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Reichert, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3801, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3801, a bill to amend the Tariff Act of 1930 to clarify the definition of aircraft and the offenses penalized under the aviation smuggling provisions under that act and for other purposes.
Question is, will the House suspend the bill and suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
Arizona Representative Gabrielle Giffords, first elected in 2006, comes to the House floor for the final time and submits her resignation letter. But before that, here's tributes from a number of colleagues. And she'll cast her last vote here. This is a piece of legislation that increases the penalties for the use of ultralight aircraft in the smuggling of drugs and contraband from Mexico into the U.S. Her resignation letter was handed in and read by her friend and colleague Debbie Wasserman-Schultz of Florida. That letter, by the way, has been released, and we have posted it on our website at cspan.org. And you'll be able to see all of this later in our video library at cspan.org as well.
Yeas are 408, nays are 0. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The Chair announces the Speaker's appointment pursuant to Section 1238B3 of the Floyd D. Spence National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2001, as amended, and the order of the House of January 5, 2011, of the following member of the part of the House to the United States-China Economic and Security Review Commission for a term to expire December 31st, 2013, Mr. Daniel M. Slane of Ohio.
Mr. Daniel M. Slane of Ohio.
Just what? Do you want me to wait a minute? For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island rise?
We be removed as a co-sponsor to H.R. 3784.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
You're ahead of me on that.
Okay.
Okay, just... The chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Culberson of Texas for today.
Without objection, the request is granted. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourned today, it adjourned to meet at 11 a.m. on Friday, January 27th, 2012, and further, when the House adjourns on that day, it adjourned to meet at noon on Tuesday, January 31st, 2012, for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Budget have until 3 p.m. on Monday, January 31st, 2012, to file reports on the following measures: H.R. 3582, H.R. 3578, and H.R. 3581.
Objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan, be authorized to insert extraneous material in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thanks,
The chair is prepared for any 1-minute response. For what purpose does the gentlelady rise? Without objection.
For the lack of leadership coming from this administration and Senate Democrats. Last night, the President came here and talked about working with any projects that would put Americans to work. Well, Mr. Speaker, House Republicans have passed 27 bipartisan bills that help job creation, and the Senate Democrats refuse to take action on them. We also gave the President a bill that creates over 20,000 jobs associated with the Keystone XL pipeline, a project that not only creates jobs but reduces energy costs and leads us to independence from Middle Eastern oil. But President Obama has once again put politics first and halted the Keystone project. Even one of the President's strongest allies, the unions, have said the President's wrong on this issue. It's clear that in an effort to save his job, the President is willing to sacrifice the jobs and energy security for Americans that Keystone will create. Mr. Speaker, the President keeps asking for blank checks so he can do more failed stimulus projects or play venture capitalists with companies like Solyndra. House Republicans will continue our progress in crafting and passing bipartisan legislation like the 27 bills that await action in the Senate. Republicans will continue to create an environment in which businesses can grow and create jobs, and will continue to work to reduce our independence from Middle Eastern oil. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition? Objection. You can proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We just saw a very moving ceremony to acknowledge our dear friend and colleague, and again I offer my appreciation to her service. But in the course, we mentioned her staff as well, and I wanted to make sure that I added my appreciation to Congresswoman Giffords' staff. But that leads me to say that we depend upon the staff of this House and our personal staffs and committee staff Not often do we get to know them personally, but I rise today to salute Steve Perkins, who will be retiring, and thank him for his service to this august body, to each and every member. Remember, those who serve in this body do not recognize Democrat or Republican. What they recognize is the great service to America. Mr. Perkins has served this Congress with excellence, commitment, and dedication. He truly should be commended and admired and respected for his service to the nation. I wish him well in his retirement with his family, his children, and his grandchildren, and I know that he will continue to be a very special person in the hearts of all of us. Steve Perkins, we thank you for your service. Thank you for letting us know how much you care about this institution, how much you care about us. Let me say we care about you. Thank you for your service to this nation and to this great body, the House of Representatives of the United States of America. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Thank you. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I raise today to honor Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Getzky, a World War II veteran from Eden Prairie, Minnesota, one of my constituents, who landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day and went on to fight at the Battle of the Bulge. He later was awarded and received both the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star for his service. During the battle to liberate occupied France, Lieutenant Colonel Getzky's mission was to protect some of Paris's most famous landmarks: the Eiffel Tower, the Notre Dame Cathedral, the Louvre, and the Arc de Triomphe, from being destroyed by retreating Nazi forces. Now, earlier this month, the people of France formally thanked Lieutenant Colonel Getzky and awarded him the Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. I want to thank Colonel Getzky for his service, his exemplary service, and also congratulate him on receiving France's highest honor, and I yield back.
The chair lays before the House.
The Honorable Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir, in 2001, strongly holding the belief that there is no higher calling than serving my country, I went from selling tires in my Tucson family business to being a freshman representative in the Arizona State House. And for 10 years I served in the Arizona legislature, in the United States Congress, and after marrying Mark, as a proud military spouse. Always I fought for what I thought was right, but never did I question the character of those with whom I disagreed. Never did I let pass an opportunity to join hands with someone just because he or she held different ideals. In public service, I found a venue for my pursuit of a stronger America by ensuring the safety and security of all Americans, by producing clean energy here at home instead of importing oil from abroad, and by honoring our brave men and women in uniform with the benefits that they earned. I found a way to care for others, and in the past year I have found a value that is unbreakable even by the most vicious of attacks. The tragic January 8th shooting in Tucson took the lives of 6 beautiful Americans and wounded 13 others, me included. Not a day goes by that I don't feel grief for the lives lost and so many others torn apart. Christina Taylor Greene, Dorothy Morris, John Roll, Phyllis Schneck, Darwin Stoddard, and Gabe Zimmerman embodied the best of America. Each in their own way, they committed their lives to serving their families, community, and country, and they died performing a basic but important act of citizenship that's at the heart of our greatness as a nation. They will always be remembered, They will be remembered always by their country and by their Congress. I don't remember much from that terrible day, but I have never forgotten my constituents, my colleagues, or the millions of Americans with whom I share great hopes for this nation. To all of them, thank you for your prayers, your cards, your well wishes, and your support. And even as I have worked to regain my speech, thank you for your faith and my ability to be your voice. The only way I ever served my district in Congress was by giving 100%. This past year, that's where I have given to my recovery. Thank you for your patience. From my first steps and first words after being shot to my current physical and speech therapy, I have given all of myself to being able to walk back onto the House floor this year to represent Arizona's 8th Congressional District. However, today I know that now is not the time. I have more work to do on my recovery before I can again serve in elected office. This past year, my colleagues and staff have worked to make sure my constituents were represented in Congress. But if I can't return, my district deserves to elect a U.S. representative who can give 100% to the job now. For that reason, I have submitted the attached letter of resignation to Arizona Governor Jan Brewer. Amid all that was lost on January 8th, there was also hope and faith. This past year, it is what I have often clung to. Hope that our government can represent the best of a nation, not the worst. Faith that Americans working together in their communities and our Congress can succeed without qualification. Hope and faith that even as we are set back by tragedy or profound disagreement, in the end we come together as Americans to set a course toward greatness. Every day I am working hard. I will recover and will return, and we will work together again for Arizona and for all Americans. Signed sincerely, Gabrielle Giffords, Member of Congress.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the leadership for allowing me this time to come to the floor. I'm going to do two short items and then address the weekly discussion on high-level nuclear waste and Yucca Mountain. First, because of this day and our focus on the sacrifice of our colleague Gabby Giffords, let me update my colleagues on Senator Mark Kirk's progress and, since he was a former colleague in this chamber, Senator Kirk's early prognosis is good, and his doctors are pleased with his progress at this point. As the senator continues his recovery, his offices will remain open to constituents. And I would just add very similar that Congressman Giffords' staff continued to do the best job they could to serve the constituents of her congressional district while she was unable to attend to many events. Staff did really pick up the ball and carry it for her, as Senator Kirk's staff will continue to do that for the state of Illinois. During Mark's 5 terms in the House of Representatives and his first in the Senate, Senator Kirk has worked tirelessly on behalf of his constituents, from traveling around the state, holding town halls, to working with members on both sides of the aisle to build consensus on key issues, to traveling overseas to advocate for strengthening American security and relationships with foreign nations. Senator Kirk has demonstrated endless energy and dedication in public service. I have no doubt that he will return to the Senate with the same zeal and passion for his job that he had when he first entered this chamber 12 years ago. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I'm a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. It's really an organization designed around legislators from all our NATO countries. It's been in existence over 50 years. Since the legislative bodies in most chambers are the funding for the military, it's important that the legislative body talks about NATO's role in the past, in the present, and in the future. During my time as a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I became great friends with a member of the British Parliament who recently passed away, and I'd like to pay tribute to him. Mr. Speaker, I would like to pay tribute to my British friend and colleague, Frank Cook, who passed away on January 12th. Frank was a longtime colleague of mine in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. As you know, the Assembly brings together members of Congress with their counterparts from Canada and Europe to talk about issues that concern us all. As a leading member of the Defense Security Committee, Frank Cook made vital contributions in debates in the Assembly from the mid-1980s to 2010 on issues as widely ranging as Afghanistan, arms control with Russia, NATO's operation in Kosovo, and its relations with Ukraine and other partners. He also served as Vice President of the Assembly. Frank embodied the spirit of the transatlantic alliance. He was never shy to express his opinions with a clear mind and a sharp wit. Even when Frank and I disagreed on policy, we remained friends and allies because we shared the values that underpin NATO: freedom, democracy, fundamental human rights, and the rule of law. We both believed that the NATO alliance was critical to our collective security and defense, and that we as legislators in our own countries needed to do everything we could to make sure it was capable of meeting the threats we face in the 21st century. I can recall many unforgettable experiences I've shared with Frank. I observed him lead a forceful debate on the controversial issues and get all sides mad, like a debate he held on Nagorno-Karabakh in Quebec in 2006. He and I took incoming artillery fire from the Taliban in Kandahar airfield in 2007. During the summer of 2010, we visited Greenland together. We visited a military encampment called Point North, which is north of the Arctic Circle. The dogs there pull sleds and provide early warning for polar bears. They appear quite scary, but Frank was the first to amble up and pet them. Frank was a throwback to a time when characters could be listed, and by being listed, that in parliamentary speak, that means being put on the party list for election. So Frank was a throwback at a time when characters could be listed and serve constituencies. But perhaps my most memorable experience is when Frank would regularly treat us with the best performance of My Way I've ever heard since old Blue Eyes himself. Not a small feat for a Brit. I learned a great deal from him and he will be deeply missed by many of his friends at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and here in Congress. Now to the business at hand, Mr. Speaker. Again, thank you for letting me come down once again to talk about a very pressing, important issue in this country, one that I'm going to continue to use the bully pulpit to help educate my colleagues, the public as a whole, even you, Mr. Speaker, on addressing the need to address high-level nuclear waste in this country. It's an issue that's been around since the development of the nuclear weapon system that we used to win World War II. Some of that waste is still there from that time, and it still sits in the same location we had it 40, 50 years ago. It's hit the international stage with the experience that Japan has had in Fukushima Daiichi and the tsunami, not just the generating facilities themselves, but what happened to the nuclear waste on site. And an international nuclear disaster that still is making it difficult for our allies in Japan, and really causes us to make sure that we look at our systems to understand what is our national policy on high-level nuclear waste and why are we not moving forward. What I've done in my times coming to the floor is go around the country and highlight where nuclear waste sites are and compare it to where we, by federal law, have stated our nuclear waste should be stored. This is all under the 1982 Energy Policy Act, and a site was located under that law in 1987. So let's go through the area for a brief review. The first site this is what happens when we no longer have pages on the House floor to help us. The first site that I visited personally was in Washington State, and the site is called Hanford, which was a good place to start in this tour of where nuclear waste is, because the vast majority of nuclear waste stored here is Department of Defense and Department of Energy waste that was used to develop our nuclear weapon systems during World War II. There are 57 million gallons of nuclear waste on site, mostly in large tanks of 750,000 to 1 million gallons each. The waste is stored 10 feet underground. The waste is 250 feet above the water table. And the waste is 1 mile from the Columbia River. And, which is not listed there, some of that waste is leaking from the tanks. So let's compare it to the site that we have decided by law to establish, which is Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain has currently no nuclear waste on site. The waste would be stored 1,000 feet underground. The waste is 1,000 feet above the water table, and the waste would be 100 miles from the Colorado River. A nuclear waste next to the Columbia River, or nuclear waste stored underneath a mountain in a desert. That's site number 1. Next, not to pick on other states and to the exclusion of mine, the next location I talked about was the Zion power plant, decommissioned, high-level nuclear waste still on site. Let's compare it to Yucca Mountain. 65 casks containing 1,135 metric tons of nuclear waste. The waste is stored above the ground, 5 feet above the water table, and 1,300 feet from Lake Michigan. And of course, this is Lake Michigan right there. Part of the time what I've been doing is highlighting a location and looking at the states surrounding. The state of Wisconsin has 2 nuclear power plants, both on Lake Michigan, similarly located. Of course, the stats for Yucca Mountain are the same. Let me add here that Yucca Mountain, we've already spent $15 billion to study this site, 20 years in the making, and we still wait. I'm not sure if this is still in the proper order that I've come down to the floor, but the next nuclear power plant that I wanted to highlight was San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. Now, this one is in California, and it's right next to the Pacific Ocean, kind of on the opposite side from where Japan is. And you can see the waves, and you can see how close it is to the Pacific Ocean. At this power plant, there's 2,300 waste rods on site. The waste is stored above the ground and in pools adjacent to the Pacific Ocean, as I said, and 45 miles from San Diego. Now, Yucca is 90 miles to 100 miles from Las Vegas. It's also in the size, the government property the size of the state of Rhode Island is controlled by a couple entities, Department of Energy being one, the Bureau of Land Management being another, and the third one, it is a nuclear test site where we tested nuclear weapons years ago. I didn't mention in Zion. Zion is about 45 miles from Chicago, Illinois. Another nuclear power plant that is in Massachusetts. And as you can see, it's next to Cape Cod, the Pilgrim Generating Facility, 2,918 spent fuel assemblies on site. Waste is stored above the ground in pools. And why is that important? Part of the problem in Fukushima Daiichi was that there was waste stored in pools. Because of the disaster, we're not really sure what happened. Either the foundation was cracked and the water, coolant water, left the pond, or the power went off, the water couldn't circulate, the heat by the rods evaporated the water, then the heat on heat caused the rods to, in essence, start to melt, which is a very dangerous situation. So many of our nuclear waste throughout this country is stored in pools around the country. Why is that important? It's because it's our national policy based upon the law passed in 1982, followed up by the location site in 87, that we'd have one geological repository. Not nuclear waste stored all over this country, but we'd have one centralized location. Now, it's important to add that in the next couple days, the Blue Ribbon Commission is going to come out with a report, and we think it's going to say it's in the national interest to have one geological repository for high-level nuclear waste, and we await with interest that report. Now we go to Idaho National Labs, a federal national laboratory in Idaho, comparing it to where nuclear waste would be stored if we would continue to comply with federal law. And we have, in Idaho, there is 5,090 canisters of waste. And a good point to note on this waste, a lot of this waste, again, is from the research done on nuclear power and nuclear weapon systems. And in that process, you create waste. As in Hanford, as they're trying to decide what to do with the waste, the containment systems to transport the waste have all been designed with the plan to store in Yucca Mountain. So when you look at the 53 million gallons in Hanford, and we're going to move that waste out of Washington State and to Yucca, time, effort, energy, and money has gone into preparing the technology to move this waste and store it in Yucca Mountain, similar to Idaho National Labs. Currently, though, we have 5,090 canisters on site. Waste is stored above the ground. Waste is 500 feet above the water table. And the waste is 50 miles from Yellowstone National Park. Then we go to the great southeast in the state of Georgia, and we look at the Savannah Generating Station, where you have 6,300 canisters of nuclear waste on site. Water is stored right below the ground, 0 to 160 feet above the water table, and as you can see from the photo, it's right next to the Savannah River. You know, part of the debate that the environmental left and anti-nuclear folks put is about water in the desert and how it's going to affect nuclear waste. And part of the educational process that I've learned going through the different sites, you really can't find a nuclear power site, of course, and all nuclear waste generated is still on site, that's not close to a body of water. So that's this whole issue about would you rather have it next to a body of water or would you rather have it in a desert? I think that debating point is pretty clear. So that's Savannah Generating Station versus Yucca Mountain. I think right before the end of last year, I came down on the floor, and the location that I was to talk about next. Of course, I got off topic a little bit and didn't really clarify and identify as Turkey Point. Turkey Point is in the state of Florida, and of course, again, we're comparing it to Yucca Mountain. And at Turkey Point, you have 1,074 metric ton vehicles of spent fuel on site. The waste is stored above the ground in pools. Waste is on Biscayne Bay at sea level, and the waste is 10 miles from the Everglades. Versus Yucca Mountain, again, defined by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982. Yucca was established by federal law by this chamber and the other chamber and the President of the United States in 1987. Yucca Mountain is in a desert. The storage site would be underneath a mountain in that desert, far away from any population that would be immediately affected. Another location that I was to address last week, which I also got off topic, is the Sequoia Nuclear Generating Station. Sequoia is in Tennessee, but it's right on the South Carolina border. At Sequoia, there is 1,094 metric ton vehicles of spent fuel on site. The waste is stored above ground in pools and dry cast. Waste is 25 feet from the groundwater, and waste is 14 miles from Chattanooga on Chickamauga Lake. Now, what I've done once we get to new states that I haven't really identified, then I've gone and looked at the senators' past statements and their voting record on this, because we had a vote on the floor this year on whether we should move forward with the dollars to finish the final scientific study by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that vote was 297 yes. Now, there's only 435 members in this chamber, a huge bipartisan vote that really I sent the signal of where the will of this chamber is. So why can't we move forward? The issue is the majority leader of the Senate happens to be from the state of Nevada, and to really get the Senate to move, you have to hold the senators from these states accountable, or at least for them to state a position as to where they stand on where the nuclear waste currently is, and really what is the proposal and what should we do with it. So having done that before, I then look at the senators from the state of Tennessee and the state of South Carolina. Senator Alexander is a yes. Senator Corker is a no. Senator Burr is a yes. A yes is let's move our nuclear waste to Yucca Mountain in a desert underneath a mountain. Senator Hagan is silent. What I mean by silent? We couldn't find any public statements. Of course, the Senate has not cast a vote. So that's what we hope maybe the senator will at some time make her position known. But as of now, we will list her as being silent. Again, why is that important? Because we really need to find out where the senators are. Under the Senate rules, to break a filibuster, you have to have 60 votes. So I'm hoping that through this process, we'll finally tally them up, which is what I'll do at the end of my time, and kind of show you where we are so far. Now, I still have a couple places around the country to address. Remember that these are just one. Many states like mine, I pointed out Zion, but we actually have 6 sites and 11 reactors. Illinois is a huge nuclear power plant. 50% of our electricity comes from nuclear power. And so even though I'm mentioning a few, you can multiply that by 3 as far as how much nuclear power plants are out there, and equivalent. If there is a nuclear power plant in your state, then your state is the storage site for nuclear waste right now. The state that I came to the floor on to highlight today and the region is the state of Arkansas and the state of Missouri. Now, Missouri, as I know, I'm from Illinois. I'm from southern Illinois. I know the state of Missouri well. The state of Missouri has a nuclear power plant called Callaway. So you could just, the same thing I'm mentioning here on this power plant in Arkansas, you can make for the Callaway plant. So let's look at the one we've chosen, which is a power plant called Nuclear One. Again, Nuclear One has 1,260 MTVs of spent fuel on site versus none at Yucca Mountain. Nuclear One has waste stored above the ground in pools and dry casts. Obviously, there's no nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain, but if there was, where would it be stored? It would be stored 1,000 feet above, underneath the ground. Nuclear One has waste adjacent to a water supply. Of course, you can see the photo right here. As I've highlighted, in almost every nuclear power plant or waste site, there's water nearby. Well, of course, Yucca Mountain's in a desert. So the waste will be stored 1,000 feet above the water table. Nuclear One is waste, and I can't pronounce it, on Lake Dardanelle, a reservoir on the Arkansas River. Now, what's a reservoir? I think by definition a reservoir is a body of water that you've created to hold water for public use, whether that's for recreation or for drinking and stuff. So there you have, you've got Nuclear One right on this reservoir. Now, what about the senators from the state of Arkansas? I mean, are they happy with this nuclear waste on site? And so let's look at their positions. We actually have a few other states represented too. First, from the state of Arkansas, we have Senator Bozeman, one of our former colleagues, has a stated position and cast votes in support of Yucca Mountain. Senator Pryor, as far as we can tell, is silent. From Iowa, Senator Grassley is a yes. Senator Hark is not only silent, he's a no. So Senator, not sure what that would be, maybe because Iowa doesn't have nuclear power plants in the state of Iowa, but there's definitely some around there. And it must be his position that nuclear waste stored around this country is okay. Then you go to the state of Kansas. Another colleague, former colleague of ours, Senator Moran, has voted yes on Yucca Mountain. It's a good place to put high-level nuclear waste in a single repository. Senator Roberts, also a yes vote. From the state of Missouri, another former colleague of ours, Senator Blunt, is a yes on moving high-level nuclear waste from the state of Missouri to a desert underneath a mountain. Senator McCaskill is silent on this, which, again, since I'm next door to the state of Missouri, I know that the Callaway nuclear power plant is in the state of Missouri, and Senator McCaskill is silent on that issue. So what's our scorecard? Where are we at with going around the countries? Because remember, Mr. Speaker, because of the Senate rules, we have to get to 60 to really push something through. So we've identified what we believe is actually 36 yes votes so far. We've identified 11, actually 10. This should be updated. We have 10 that we really don't know their position. In other words, they have no public statement, or they have not cast a vote. And then we have 8 definite no's, which means they have made public statements in opposition to moving nuclear waste underneath a mountain in a desert, or they've cast a vote somewhere in some type or signed a letter. We're happy to be corrected on any of this analysis of where senators are, but I think it's time that we start to get some accountability in this process. Why have we not moved forward on Yucca Mountain? And the answer is pretty clear, that when this administration was running for the presidency, he, wanting to get support from the senior senator from the state of Nevada, promised not to move forward. That's fine. It was a political decision. He's holding to his commitment to do that at the cost of what? Nuclear waste being held across this country, in states around this country, in places that after Fukushima Daiichi, you might argue, might not be the best place to have this nuclear waste. So the President and the Majority Leader of the Senate has placed this in the political realm. Elections have consequences. We're approaching an election cycle. There'll be senators on the ballot in November. What is their position on what their state and what should be the national position on what we do with high-level nuclear waste. So we do know we've got a lot who have on record saying nuclear waste ought to go in a single repository in a desert underneath a mountain. We do believe that the Blue Ribbon Commission this week will say this country needs a single repository. We do have 10 senators that we do not know their position, and to their credit, we have 8 that we do know their position in opposition. But it looks, from being a casual observer, and if the trend continues, that we're getting close to a majority of U.S. senators that say that we should have a single repository, and that single repository should be what's been identified under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and the following legislation in 1987 that said Yucca Mountain is a site. Why is this important? Fukushima Daiichi is example number 1. The health and wellness of our citizens, the location of all this nuclear waste. And we have to continue to highlight these concerns because the nuclear waste isn't going away. In fact, we've got some nuclear power plants being constructed right now. Maybe in 10 or 15 years they'll start generating. And when they do, they'll start creating nuclear waste. And that nuclear waste is going to have to go somewhere. Now, the question that we've highlighted throughout this year, we'll finish in a couple months, should that be in all these states and all these locations, or should it be at a single repository? Mr. Speaker, I look forward to coming down numerous times in the future to continue to identify each state, each senator, and then allow the public the information so that they can make a decision if this is an important criteria in this next election cycle. I hope that the answer would be yes, so that we would follow up on a national policy to deal with high-level nuclear waste. We've only spent $15.5 billion in over 20 years to identify Yucca Mountain as a site. If we were to try to find a new site, we throw away the $15 billion, the 20 years of research, and we'll have to have another 20-year time of research and development and another $15 billion to get to the same location we are today. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate your time, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
That's king. Speaker's announced policy of January 5th. The chair recognizes the gentleman, Mr. King from Iowa, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the privilege and the honor to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and to follow the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, here in the well. And I want to first say that he makes clear sense with the argument that he makes. We don't hear these arguments often enough. And too often, this Congress is dealing with superfluous issues, political issues, rather than practical solutions. It brings to mind, for me, the President's speech last night from in front of where you are right now, Mr. Speaker. And very early in his speech, the President said he wants to see a future where we are in control of our own energy. Well, that statement is, part of that solution is encompassed by the delivery of John Shimkus here a little bit ago, without to do with nuclear waste. I'd say also there are other things that we can do is from a technical perspective to utilize that, recycle that, and some of the nuclear waste is tied up because of an executive order that was signed by President Jimmy Carter clear back more than 30 years ago. We haven't cracked the code on how to resolve that, even though the science has caught up. We have a long ways to go. And we need to have an administration that actually means this, a future where we are in control of our own energy. The instant that I heard that statement last night, Mr. Speaker, it occurred to me that the President's in control of our energy, but the American people are not in control of our own energy. And I would point out the Keystone XL pipeline for an example. And I heard an instantaneous rumbling here on the floor of the House of Representatives when the statement was made that we were going to be in control of our own energy. Also, the President said that he wants to see an all-of-the-above energy policy. Well, the all-of-the-above policy includes responsible utilization of all of the nuclear fuel that we have, and then responsible positioning of it when we can no longer utilize the energy within it. But it also includes drilling offshore, and it includes drilling the non-national park public lands in the United States, and it includes bringing in energy from other places on the North American continent from our friends. Our #1 trading partner, Canada, are good friends to the north. They are in energy export despair right now, Mr. Speaker, because they've listened to what the President had to say. For 3 years, the study has gone on about the Keystone XL pipeline, 1,666 miles of pipeline that runs from Canada down to the Gulf Coast. And it allows for a spur to go off of that to a future refinery that I hope is built in southeastern South Dakota, and that would be able to transfer refined oil that would come from northern Alberta in the oil sands in northern Alberta and be able to distribute that across the country, primarily to points from there south and east. Well, Mr. Speaker, the President has blocked the Keystone XL pipeline, and he announced last night that he's opening up 75% of the I've forgotten the exact word that he used, 75% of federal lands that are eligible, I think would be a fair way to characterize his statement, to drilling for oil. Well, that's news to all of us. It's news to the oil industry, I believe, and the previous State of the Union address that he gave, if I recall correctly, he mentioned that he has opened up drilling in the Gulf Coast again. At least one of these addresses that he made, that's what he has said. But when you look at the permits, a different story. They say they're opening up permits again after the BP spill, but we've lost a lot of deep water rigs to other parts of the oil developing world, including outside the Western Hemisphere. And the industry tells me that once you lose a big rig from a location, it takes about 4.5 years to transition it back into the Gulf Coast again. That's happened to rig after rig down off of the Gulf Coast. And the announcement that this is the most oil that we produce, or most petroleum that we produce domestically in 8 years, may be true. I don't know anyone else that knew those numbers in this chamber either, and I'm wondering how they defined it, how they quantified it. But in any case, we have a lot of oil that's being produced up in the Bakken region of North Dakota. The reason for that, Mr. Speaker, is because they found the oil up there. It's on private land. The federal government has not as many tools to obstruct the development of oil production in the Bakken region of North Dakota as they might have in that 75% of the federal property that the President addressed last night. I don't know that any of us believe that he's real serious about wanting to develop American energy, especially American petroleum energy. And if he was serious about it, why would he not direct the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who he spoke kindly of last night, why would he not direct her to sign the agreement with Canada so that we can go ahead and build the Keystone XL pipeline? That's the only federal procedural obstruction left in the way, is a permit that is the agreement between Canada and the United States, that all it's required to do is to drop that last section of pipe in place right there at the 49th parallel at the border between the United States and Canada. The rest of that is all green light. And so if it weren't for the fear that the billions that would be invested for a real return, not to mention the 100,000 jobs that would be created if you look at the iterations that come forth from not just the construction of the pipeline, but the operation of and the economic development that flows from it, 100,000 jobs. And the speech last night was about jobs, and we can't have the 20,000 jobs instantaneously lit up by the Keystone XL pipeline, or the additional 80,000 jobs that flow from the economic development from the Keystone XL pipeline. And why? Not because there's a legitimate environmental concern. There is not one left. And not because, as the President said, he needs more time to study it. There has been 3 years to study it. Now think about how this works if you're the President of the United States. You're constantly barraged with decisions that must be made. And You have set up a network, a pyramid of advisors that filter that, so you're only dealing with the most difficult problems that there are. Your subordinates take care of all the other decisions, just the most difficult. And no one, no matter how smart, no matter how quick, really has the mental space to deal with all of the things that go on here in the United States of America. It is humanly impossible. And so the President has a series of advisors. They advise him. Now, the President has said, I haven't had time to study the Keystone XL pipeline. Well, the President of the United States is never going to have time to study all the nuances that have to do with all of the components of the Keystone XL pipeline. Hardly any member of Congress could dedicate a career to know all the things there are to know about the Keystone XL pipeline. But it isn't how we make decisions in the real world. It isn't how the President makes decisions in the real world. You know, what if the Iranians launched a nuke and it was in the air? Would the President say, I don't have time to make a decision? I'd like to think not. I'd like to believe, Mr. Speaker, that the President would make that decision in a split-second heartbeat. In fact, I'd like to believe he had that delegated so there could be instantaneous action and response and we could shoot that missile down before it could get over the continental United States and threaten it and be within the cone of its target. I'd like to think that would happen. I'd like to think the President had fail-safe systems in place to protect us from national defense, and I'd like to think that he has a system in place where he can trust his advisors to look at something that is conceptually like the Keystone XL pipeline and be able to say, Mr. President, we've studied this for 3 years. If I'm listening to that briefing, it's already cleared a lot for me at that point. And what have you found out would be my question if I had to ask it. And the answer would be, there's no environmental risk. Zero. We have tens of thousands of miles of pipeline that pump a lot of things more toxic than crude oil through it, underneath of the ground of the United States of America, and the average number of problems we have that I hear about is zero. And so if we had had spills from an oil pipeline, I guarantee you the environmental extremists would have let us know, and they would have embellished it to the point where everybody in America would know about how horrible it might be if one of those pipelines got a crack in it and some oil seeped out. But instead, environmental extremists come with this argument. My gosh, it goes over the Ogallala Aquifer. It's an important aquifer, a wonderful freshwater aquifer, and they pump water out of it to irrigate and water cattle and people. That's all true. But also it's true that there are hundreds of miles of pipeline that run over the top of the Ogallala Aquifer now, and some of them have things in it that are less digestible than the petroleum that's coming out of the oil sands in northern Alberta. And so I don't have heartburn over that because we have already established we can build pipelines effectively and we can build them safely with a very, very, very minimal risk to any spills. Statistically, it's almost zero. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, I'm not just speaking as someone who has an opinion having read a briefing document put together by someone else. I'm actually a guy who's gone out and worked on a pipeline, built pipelines. I've been down in the ditch. I've been up on the bank. I've been a swamper on a bending crew. I've been a welding helper. I built pipelines in Kansas. I built them in Iowa. And I understand the mechanics of it, and I understand the system. I understand the labor structure, the business component of it. And by the way, I'd say this to the Keystone XL pipeline people. Let's do this. Let's take the risk. There's a lot of money invested now anyway. This country needs to move forward. This pipeline will be built. It'll either be built with the approval of this president, or it'll be built after the disapproval of the American people elect us a new president. And so why wouldn't we just take this risk and move this ball down the field a little ways, start that investment and build this pipeline in the United States, build all of it that's appropriate. The only thing that can't be done is you can't cross the 49th parallel. You can come down from Canada right up to that line. We don't know how wide our border is. It's, you know, it's infinitely narrow, at least in theory. But I'll just say, let's say a 20-foot section of pipe. That's what I'd leave out. Build it down from Canada, stop 10 feet from the 49th parallel, take the GPS locator out there, drive a stake in the middle at the border. Step over the other side. Oh, wait a minute. Bring your passport, then step over the other side. And start 10 feet south of the 49th parallel and build that pipeline all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Now we have it all built except for 20 feet. And we've done it all within the law, all within the regulations. Everything else is all cleared and wide open. And that 20-foot section of pipe can sit there then on the spoil pile. It can just sit there and we can look at that for a while. Let's set up a webcam and a website. And then all the American people and everybody around the world, including the oil sheikhs and the oil cartels and those tyrants that are rich with oil money that are getting more and more belligerent in proportion to the oil price, they can watch too on the webcam, on the website, as that piece of pipe 20 feet long sits there waiting for the president to let Hillary Clinton sign the agreement with Canada. So that 20-foot section of pipe could be set in place and welded. And then we could open up the valve and send that oil down to the refineries. And oh, what a breath of economic fresh air that would be. Mr. Speaker, that's what should be done. And with the website and the web camera watching this still piece of pipe sitting there on the spoil pile right at the 49th parallel, what we need to have also is a little counter on there. That is, how many days they've stalled, how long does he have to think about it now, and how much money is being lost, and how many jobs are being lost. 3 little counters there on that website, along with the webcam shot of the still photo of, well, we can make it a video, can't we, of the section of pipe 20 feet long that's sitting there, 10 feet of it to go in Canada, 10 in the United States. And by the way, somebody's going to sign that permit someday, sooner rather than later. Whether it is the new Secretary of State that will be appointed by the successor to Barack Obama, or whether it's Hillary Clinton that might sign that agreement. I'm standing here, Mr. Speaker, saying this will happen. The Keystone XL pipeline will be built. The American people support it. They know it's environmentally safe and sound. The labor unions want it. There's a tugging of war going on within the political support base for the president. And he found himself in a situation where he had to decide between environmental extremists, a very strong base for him, or the labor unions, another strong base for him. And he essentially said to America, I'm making a political decision here, and I'm going to go with my environmental extremist friends. And the labor unions are going to have to just swallow this one for a while. That's the answer. And he told us he didn't have time to study. And Congress said, you shall come back with an answer within 60 days of whether this is an economic security risk for the United States, this pipeline, whether it needs to be built for economic security reasons or not, national security reasons or not. And 28 days into the 60 days that he had to study, now remember he had all of those 3 years to study like everybody else did, and all of those advisors to synthesize this for him, boil it down, and give him 1 or 2 or 3 points is all he really needed to know. But instead he opted to jump the gun, go only 28 days into the 60-day period of time he had, and then say, I didn't have time. Huh. How would that be? What if you had to go out and run a race that was 30 or, say, 60 laps long? And you run that race for 28 of the 60 laps, and then you go, well, I didn't have time to finish the race, so I'm quitting now. Cut this thing off, shut it down. We know the difference. The American people, Mr. Speaker, know the difference between reasons and excuses. The President has given the lamest of excuses. No thinking person in the country believes that it was a reason that he didn't have time to study the Keystone XL pipeline. It will be built. We need to build it all within the United States and within Canada, leave out that 20-foot section, and for the people that might want to set it as a 50-foot section or a 10-foot section, I'm good with all that. I'm not going to quibble. I'll just tell you, here's what I'll do personally, if you'll let me. I'll go up there and swing that section of pipe into place myself, and I'll go down there and grab the welder and I'll weld it in place myself. And I'll weld my initials on that pipe too while I'm there, and the date. And that date and the time will coincide with the last date and time that'll be on the website. That'll be ticker tape rolling through telling us how much money it's costing not to complete that Keystone XL pipeline, how many days it's been, how many jobs it's cost, and this economic development piece. So a president that comes to the floor and says last night, I'm for all of the above energy policy, well, let's see. Except for the Keystone XL pipeline, except for drilling offshore, if that means actually issuing permits, except for this mystery that how much public lands he's going to hold off of production. I think we ought to drill all the non-national park public lands where there's oil. And you know, we don't know how much oil there is in the United States. We haven't been able to examine it. We have not committed the resources to do the inventory. We used to have an inventory that there was 406 trillion cubic feet of natural gas available in the United States. We know that number's a lot higher than that now. We've learned how to develop it. And when we look at the fracking technology, that's another thing that the President didn't speak to last night. But if he's for all of the above, the EPA should not be turning over every stone, looking at every geological nook and cranny, trying to come up with a way to block fracking. the fracking technology that's opened up so much energy to this country, developed by Americans. We have about 1.2 million utilizations of fracking, and now the EPA has found some elements that could have been potentially used in fracking in a shallow water location someplace in Wyoming that they say could have actually come from a fracking utilization in a well somewhere. They've not tied it together. They just run that red herring up the flagpole, and now the environmentalists can hyperventilate, and they can try to find another way to shut down energy production in America. Why? Mr. Speaker, what's going through the thick skulls of these people? And to the American people, why do they have patience with that kind of thinking? The effort that goes after the economic development efforts in the United States. What's going on? And here's what's behind it. The President alluded to that last night, too, come to think of it. He said he doesn't think the votes are in this Congress to pass cap and tax. Oh, wait a minute. I might have amended the President's quote a little bit, Mr. Speaker. So I'd back up just a little and say he didn't think the votes were here to pass his proposal for his version in his speech of cap and trade. No, they aren't. They aren't because the American people have wised up, and so have a lot of members of Congress, and we have 89 new freshman Republicans in this place, many of them the result of what happens when you try to advance bad policies through this Congress. So the votes aren't there for cap and tax. That's true. The EPA is looking to implement it by order of the President and his public statement that they could implement and promulgate rules that to end up with the same thing as cap and tax. Now, cap and tax does, and so underneath that is the almost religious belief by environmental extremists that if you burn petroleum products and these hydrocarbons release into the atmosphere CO2, and it does, by the way, I concede that point, the CO2 in the atmosphere, they believe, is the cause of global warming. Now, first you have to come to a conclusion that global warming is taking place, and then you have to come to the conclusion that it's an unnatural global warming taking place caused by activity of man. Then you have to conclude the activity of man that causes it is the release and suspension of CO2 into the atmosphere. So I listened to all that and I think that is a tough equation to make. And it was really hard for the people in the East Anglia University and Penn State, Michael Mann and some of those other people to make that case. They had to fabricate, remember? Mr. Speaker, they had to fabricate the case for the actual data that would support even that the Earth was getting warmer, let alone the calculations that it's being caused by CO2 suspended in the atmosphere, let alone that that CO2 is sourced from industry, let alone that that industry is primarily U.S. industry. So I just ask a few, you might call them dumb questions, Mr. Speaker. I call them simple questions. The basic questions that I sometimes find out nobody asks. Everybody is a specialist nowadays, and they only deal with a component of the overall picture. They don't look at the big picture and be a generalist to say, wait a minute, arrange this all for me so a logical, rational, deductive mind can come to a conclusion. Do that first, and then we'll get to the details. And so the physicists deal with the formula that are handed to them by the meteorologist, and the data comes from other places. They accept what comes to them, and they work within their zone, and then who picks up the whole picture? I don't know. So I just asked this question. I said, tell me, if CO2 suspended in the atmosphere by U.S. industry is the cause of the theory that global warming exists, then would you tell me how much CO2 is in the atmosphere from U.S. industry, because they propose they're going to cut it by 1/17 and each year till the year 2050. So if they know the formula that's going to turn down the Earth's thermostat, and by the way, I spent a lot of my life cold, so I'm not sure that that's a good idea, but I do know that on their comparison chart, they have a whole list of bads on one side of the ledger and no list of goods, good things that might happen from a warmer Earth. And so I look at this and I thought, all right, so show me. I want to know how much atmosphere has the gravity of the Earth attracted throughout all this time of it orbiting around the sun and floating through the galaxy. And so we get this answer back. It's not a disputed number. The gravity's pulled at so many metric tons. I don't have the number committed to memory, Mr. Speaker, but then it's okay, so fine. Now we know how much atmosphere there is. Now I'd like to know how much of that atmosphere is CO2 suspended in it as a result of the cumulative effect of U.S. industry since the beginning of the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. So that calculated out to be, when we did this, 205 years of Industrial Revolution. So We add this all up. I said, now take all of this atmosphere of the Earth, draw it in a circle for me. 2 sheets of drywall, so to speak, an 8-foot diameter circle, a little bit higher in my hand, all the way around. That's the size of the Earth's atmosphere in your pie chart. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask, think about how big a circle would you draw in the middle of that 8-foot diameter circle in order to demonstrate the total volume of the CO2 that's suspended in the Earth's atmosphere, the cumulative effect for 205 years of the Industrial Revolution, this thing that we're going to reduce by 1/17 of its emissions each year. By the way, that's 1/17 of 1/205th the first year. We're going to adjust that, and we're going to use that to turn the Earth's thermostat down. How big is that circle of CO2 suspended in the atmosphere? 8-foot circle is all the atmosphere. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I'll just say, here's the answer. One might imagine that it's a 4-foot circle of CO2 suspended or something that could really impact the Earth's temperature. Well, it's not. It is 0.56, Mr. Speaker, just a little over a ½ an inch in diameter. That's the size of the CO2 that's suspended in the Earth's atmosphere, the cumulative effect for 205 years of U.S. industry. Some of those times when we were belching a lot of smoke out into the atmosphere from burning raw coal in ways that aren't nearly as clean as they are now. So I looked at that and I thought, are you kidding me? An 8-foot circle is the Earth's atmosphere, and we're going to take this 0.56 circle of all the CO2 that's in there from the U.S., and we're going to reduce that by 1/17, which is actually 1/17 of the 205 years that it has accumulated, remember? And we're going to do that for the next 50 years and dial the Earth's temperature down? What utter arrogance to think that we could do that. Haven't the physicists looked at this also? I don't think they have. And so then I go back and, see, I'm a generalist, so I go across some other studies, Mr. Speaker, and I found a book called Human Universals. And it's written by a Professor Brown from the University of California at Berkeley. And I don't usually go there to find my enlightened authors, but he's the only one I could find that actually has written a book on human universals. What are the common denominators of humanity? What do you see in human beings that has been true since the beginning of time, the first civilization? What did Adam and Eve do, and what did every generation of humanity do that was common to them then, that's common to us now, and common to every generation across all cultures, civilizations, continents, and tribes? And there are a list of about 120 things in his book, and he explains almost all of them. But one of them, Mr. Speaker, this human universal is every generation of man has tried to not just worship the weather or was affected by the weather. Every generation of man has tried to change the weather. To change the weather. You know, they sacrificed virgins down in Central America and sometimes ripped their heart out and threw them down in the pit, and that was going to change the weather and get it to rain or not rain as the situation called for. I just wonder, Mr. Speaker, if this cap and tax is not the modern version of the rain dance. And the weather is probably not going to change because we argue in here, and it's probably not going to change because we change the emissions. I think we should, though, put our factories together and control our emissions and have the cleanest atmosphere we can have because it's good for the air we breathe. But I think it's utter arrogance to believe we're going to adjust the Earth's thermostat with the methodology that we have here. But we do know the methodology of cap and tax that was advocated by the President last night is a methodology that will transfer our wealth and our industry to countries that care a lot less about the atmosphere, which is my point, Mr. Speaker. And then, so I didn't really intend to go down that path, but I thought it was important to bring it up. And I'd make another point that came to my attention last night, and it was in very early part of the President's speech. He spoke of being, this is the first time in 2 decades that Osama bin Laden doesn't threaten the American people. Very good thing. And I give the President maximum kudos for that, and the SEALs, of course. And it was the right decision, it was the right order, and it was the right result. A very good thing. But he went on to say, and by the way, he delivered that in a subtle fashion that was becoming of the President of the United States in the speech he gave last night. But he went on to say the Taliban's momentum has been broken. I disagree to this extent. The Taliban's momentum has shifted from military tactical to political. They have a lot of political momentum. It's not been broken. Their political momentum has been accelerated, Mr. Speaker. And I would make this point that if we look at the country of Afghanistan and look back through its history, starting at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, Well, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance, the Mujahideen, many of them at the time, took on the Russians and fought them through that decade. With the help of Charlie Wilson and at least one member in this Congress seated today, the help from U.S. missiles that took out Russian helicopters, but the tenacity of the Northern Alliance today, the tribes from the northern part of Afghanistan that took on the Russians and drove the Russians out of Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance leaders today, the men who mounted horseback and themselves led the cavalry charge on horseback and attacked Russian tanks with AK-47s in their hands. These courageous men are the men that drove the Russians out of Afghanistan, and at that point there was a power vacuum. The Taliban filled up Afghanistan, and we remember what they did. They blew up the Buddhist temples. They drove the life expectancy of a woman down to the only country in the world that had that life expectancy, the lower life expectancy for women than men was Afghanistan. They treated them horribly. Afghanistan was digressing back to the Stone Age. It was a fertile area for al-Qaeda training camps. We got hit September 11th. The United States went in to help them with special forces. The Northern Alliance rose up again, and with our help, drove the Taliban out of Afghanistan, and then they handed over their heavy weapons and embraced the Constitution that was proposed by the United States State Department, accepting that we would look out for their political interests. And what do they have? These warriors who defeated the Russians and the Taliban and lost their political influence because they trusted the Constitution to represent them and gave up their heavy weapons are now watching the White House and President Karzai negotiate with the Taliban. The Taliban's momentum has not been broken. It's been transitioned into political power, and they are looking today to hand political power over to the Taliban in Afghanistan so that the Afghanistan government will reflect the wishes of the Taliban and less reflect the wishes of the Northern Alliance. Mr. Speaker, I'd inquire as to how much time I might have remaining. I expected that was the case. And so